I think I've mentioned to you before how upsetting the war in Ukraine is to me. And still, when I watch the news at night, I just cry. It's so sad to see the children suffering. I'm so moved by the way families take care of the grandparents and to get them out of the war zone, to see the destruction of schools and hospitals, and it's just overwhelming. And I have been very attentive to the words of Pope Francis and his call for an end to the violence there, his trying to do everything he can to make people aware of how horrible a war this is. But the one thing I hadn't heard, and I needed to research it, was what was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church saying? And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But before I get there, we just need a little bit of background. So the war in Ukraine is really a result of three factors. It's geopolitical, that there is an issue of geography. Putin believes that Ukraine should be part of Russia, and Putin is against Ukraine having a democracy. He believes that he should decide for the people what is best for them. It is also an economic war. Russia wants to use its fossil fuels to control the economy and the direction of Europe, and also to use its rare earth metals as an economic bargaining chip in the world economy. But what's been overlooked by some people is that this war is also a religious and theological conflict. And we need to step back a little bit in history to understand why that is the case. The Roman Empire collapsed in 476, and there was the western part, which was known as the Latin part of the Roman Empire, and there was the eastern part, which was known as the Greek part of the empire because of the languages that they spoke. When the Roman Empire collapsed, the West was in disarray, and the only central powerful figure in the West was the Pope, and people looked to him to make decisions because there was no government there. And Rome had been founded by St. Peter, and the successors of Peter believed that they were to be the leader of Christians. In the Greek church, they were still protected by the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and there was a lack of communication with Rome. It was just too difficult. It took months to get anything. So the local bishops became very powerful. And the Greek church, the Orthodox Church, is set up differently than the Roman church. The Greek church structure has 15 hierarchies, 9 of whom are patriarchs. And a patriarch, the Eastern Church considers the Pope a patriarch, but the Pope obviously thinks he's different than the patriarchs or higher up. Among the patriarchs, the first among equals is the Patriarch of Constantinople, which is the city of Istanbul today. Then there is the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and one of the more important ones is the Patriarch of Moscow, probably the largest of all the patriarchies. So another event that happened was in 988. There was a very important event in the Eastern Church, and it was called the Baptism of Rus. So the Baptism of Rus took place in the city of Kiev, which is the capital of Ukraine, and Vladimir the Great wanted an alliance with the Emperor of Constantinople, and in order to do that, he needed to become Christian. And so he ordered all of the people that were under his control to be baptized and to become Christian. And this happened in the city of Kiev, in the Dnieper River, where thousands of people just entered the river, and there were priests along, and everybody was baptized at once. And this was the beginning of the Russian Orthodox Church. It began in Kiev. In 1054, the Latin Church and the Greek Church split forever. There's still two different versions of Christianity. The one remaining faithful to the Latin traditions, and our liturgy is much simpler than the Greek. And in the Greek church, some could speak their local language, like in the Church of Moscow, they speak an ancient form of Russian, Greek, or Syriac, or other languages. Let's jump ahead. And then what happened in 2014 was that Russia, under Putin, took over Crimea. Crimea was a part of Ukraine that had previously been a part of Russia. In the 1960s, Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine for political and for geographic reasons because it was difficult to manage. And what happened is Putin wants to rebuild the empire, and so he took over Crimea. In 2018, 4 years later, the Patriarch of Constantinople, who I said is sort of the first among equals, he recognized Ukraine as a separate church from the Russian Orthodox Church. That did not go over well with the Patriarch of Moscow, nor with the politicians in Russia. And so the two leaders today, Putin and Patriarch Kirill, which is the Russian name for Cyril, are trying to reconstruct the Russian Orthodox Church as it was. So I put together my research, and I'm going to read it to you a little bit. So the current events in Ukraine are linked to the Russian government retaking Crimea in 2014. Crimea is a province that had traditionally been a part of Russia, but in the 1960s was given by the Soviet Union to Ukraine. Mr. Putin expropriated Crimea for Russia and did so using the doctrine known as Russian world. In Russian, it's called Ruski Mir. This rationale, which is based in Russian Orthodox thought, says that all Russian peoples should be united under one government and under one church. Russian world is an ideological worldview that allows no deviation from long-standing Russian Orthodox views. Mr. Putin claims to be a devout follower of Russian Orthodox religion. He has found a supporter in the Patriarch of Russian Orthodoxy, Kirill. Patriarch Kirill has called the presidency of Mr. Putin a miracle of God. Putin has said that the two pillars of Russian society are nuclear armament and Russian Orthodoxy, one that guarantees external security and the other that guarantees the moral health of the country. Patriarch Kirill believes that Russia is the victim in a cultural war with the West. Kirill described the war in Ukraine as nothing less than an apocalyptic struggle between good and evil. Its outcome, he said, will determine where humanity will end up on which side of God. Both Kirill and Putin believe that the values of the West are a threat to the Russian world. Their major enemy is freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. Under Putin, many laws were passed to ban other Christian religions from forming in the Soviet Union, and both of them believe that if people had the freedom of expression or the freedom of the press, that they would say the wrong things, and that's immoral for them. The war is not about Russia capturing Ukraine. It is about Russia challenging the Western world, which Mr. Putin and Patriarch Kirill both regard as evil. So where is the lesson for all of us in this? That's where we turn to today's gospel. And I'd like you to listen to the first lines of today's gospel. Tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to listen to Jesus. The reason that tax collectors and the sinners were going to Jesus is because they were banned from the temple. They couldn't go and worship with the regular Jewish community because they were outcast. The tax collectors were Jewish people who worked for the Romans, and because you work for the Romans, you are not allowed to pray with us. And the sinners was a collective group of people who did the most menial tasks in society. They worked in the sewers, they slaughtered animals, they prepared foods, and they were thought to be unclean. And because they weren't welcomed into the Jewish synagogues, they followed Jesus because in Jesus they heard a message of compassion and love. In the next line of the gospel, and the Pharisees and the scribes began to complain, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So to them, the Pharisees and the scribes, Jesus addressed this parable. The story in today's gospel is about opening our doors, our hearts, and our minds to others. Recall how the Pharisees were disgusted with Jesus because he ate with sinners. The view of Patriarch Kirill and Mr. Putin is like that of the Pharisees. They want to be the gatekeepers, one religiously and the other politically. They want to decide who enters salvation and who God has chosen and who is right, and it's only by their standards. That is not what Jesus calls us to do. On a personal level, for you and me, do we leave ourselves open to others, or do we hate them? How can we proclaim the gospel if we won't talk to someone or listen to him or her? How can we have healing and reconciliation if we exclude people and do not engage them? Jesus welcomed all people so that there might be reconciliation. We must do the same. The irony of today's gospel is that the ones who wanted to avoid sinners have themselves become the sinners by not opening their hearts, their minds, and their doors. Only by doing this will there be peace both in our world and in our lives.